My parents fired me from my own family by group message. It came in at 7:42 on a Tuesday evening. 12 people on the thread, and it said, "We've talked as a family, and we think it's best you step away for now." I read it at my kitchen table, with a dish towel still over my shoulder. 12 names I'd known my whole life. My parents, my brother and his wife, 2 cousins, an uncle. And my Aunt Faye, the woman who taught my Sunday school class, who'd known me since the hospital, reacted with a thumbs up. That little cartoon hand sat under the words like a stamp on a form, like a notarized decision. I looked at it until the screen went dark, and then I picked the phone back up and looked at it some more. I want to be honest about what I felt because it wasn't rage. I'm a bookkeeper. I've spent my whole life reading numbers, and a number never flatters anybody, it just tells you what happened. And what that little thumbs up told me, plain as a balance sheet, was that a vote had been taken, and I had lost. And nobody in that kitchen thought I needed to be in the room for it, so I did what I always do. I closed the books. My reply took me 1 draft. No paragraph of hurt, no negotiation, no period of silence where I let them wonder. Just this, understood. I'll respect that and step away from the family fun too. Then I opened my laptop. That night, I closed my contribution. 1 transfer, scheduled to run at midnight the way it had run at midnight for years. I canceled it. The click was small and quiet, the kind of thing that shouldn't move anything in the world. Then I turned off the ringer, and I went to bed. At 2:15 in the morning, my phone started buzzing on the dresser. I know the exact minute because I looked one eye, screen glare in a dark room. It went dark, and then it buzzed again before it finished. I lay there and listened to it rattle against the wood, patient as rain on a roof, and I did not answer it. I want to tell you my hands were shaking. They weren't. That's the part that still unsettles me. My hands were the calmest they'd been in 6 years. By sunrise, the buzzing had a number. 89 missed calls, 41 from my father, 26 from my mother. The rest from people who hadn't called me in months, some who hadn't called me in years. Thumbs up Faye, calling me at 4 in the morning like we were close. There was 1 voicemail. I'll get to it. But here's what none of them understood that night. Sitting in that dark house, with their phones lighting up one after another, like a switchboard, nobody was working. The family fun, the thing I just closed with a single click, was the smallest thing I'd been carrying. It was the loose change of it, the tip. It would take them 1 month to find the rest, 1 piece at a time. And by the time they had all the pieces laid out on the table, every single one of them would understand exactly what a woman looks like when she finally sets down something she should never have been carrying. Alone, let me tell you how it started. Let me tell you who I am, so the rest of this makes sense. My name is Nora Hale. And I keep the books for 24 small businesses in Riverton, Tennessee, a town small enough that the river runs through the middle of it, and everybody knows whose truck is parked where. My office is 2 rooms above the hardware store on Miller Street. A coffee maker older than my assistant. A window that rattles when the freight trucks pass. Numbers are how I make my living, and, if I'm honest, how I make sense of people. Because a ledger never flatters anybody. It doesn't care how you dress on Sunday or what you tell the neighbors. It just tells you what happened, which, I've learned, is more than most families can say. I should tell you plainly, because it matters later. I was not a woman with money hidden somewhere. I drove a 12-year-old Civic with a check engine light I made peace with. I rented the little apartment right above my own office, walked down 1 flight of stairs to work. Walked up 1 flight to sleep and told myself a house could wait 1 more year. Every spring, tax season. I stayed at that desk until 1 in the morning. Running other people's returns to make back the ground I'd quietly given away. I wasn't sitting on a fortune. I was working double to cover a hole nobody knew I was filling. But from the outside, you'd never have guessed any of that was coming. We were the Hales, we looked solid. My father, Wade, spent 31 years as a service manager at Tillman Ford Lincoln, out on the highway. He kept a pen clipped in his shirt pocket at all times, and he believed in oil changes and in God, roughly in that order. He was the kind of man who fixed a thing before you noticed it was broken, and never once told you he'd done it. My mother, Loretta, ran the women's ministry at First Baptist. And she ran our family's reputation the way a general runs a war with maps nobody else was allowed to see. There was a casserole on every grieving porch in the county before the family even finished crying, and Loretta's name was on the dish. She knew what the town thought of us because she decided what the town thought of us. That was her whole life's work, and she was very, very good at it. My brother Cole is 3 years older than me. He fixes furnaces and air handlers, has 2 kids and a good heart, and absolutely no head. For paperwork, the kind of man who does $8,000 of honest work. And forgets to send the invoice. And then there's my Aunt Faye, my mother's younger sister, who has agreed with whoever spoke last since roughly 1975. If you want to know what Faye thinks, you only have to know who she talked to most recently. That was us. Sunday dinners, matching photos at Easter. A porch swing my father hung the summer I turned 9. From the street, we looked like something you could lean on. And I believed in us the way you believe in a bridge you cross every day. You don't inspect it. You don't stop your car halfway across and get out to check the bolts. You just trust that it holds, because it always has, because your father told you it would. I crossed that bridge for 34 years without once looking down. Then, 6 years before that group message, I went looking in a kitchen drawer for a pack of batteries, and I found the bill for everything instead. It was Father's Day, 2020. The dealership had closed that March. Corporate consolidation, they called it, which is a very long phrase for 31 years fitting into a single cardboard box. My father carried that box to his truck himself and never once let anybody see his face while he did it. He was 57. Too young for Social Security, too old for anyone to hire, and far too proud to say either of those sentences out loud. At dinner that day, he carved the ham like nothing in the room had an edge but him. We ate. My mother talked about the church picnic, and after the pie, the TV remote died. And I went digging through the kitchen junk drawer. For batteries, the same drawer that had held twine and dead pens. And loose screws since the Reagan administration. Under an old seed catalog, I found an envelope from the county trustee. It was already open, and it was very, very red. Delinquent property taxes. $4,910, past due. I stood there with a pack of double-A batteries in one hand and my whole childhood in the other. Through the window over the sink, I could see my father out in the garage, wiping down a workbench that was already clean. Wiping the same spot over and over. I walked out there with the envelope, and he looked at it the way men look at a diagnosis. The buyout on the pension came to almost nothing, he said quietly. He didn't look up. Cents on the dollar, lawyers got the rest. He was behind on the county, behind on the light bill. And one payment behind on a home equity line I hadn't even known existed, a second mortgage against the house I grew up in. Then he said the sentence that decided the next 6 years of my life. Your mother can't know the number. He finally looked at me. You know how she is about being seen. He put his hand flat on the workbench when he said it, palm down on the wood, like a man swearing on a Bible in a courtroom with no judge. Your mother can never know how much. And nobody else can know at all. So we built it right there, that weekend, the two of us, the way you build anything in a garage, quietly, out of sight of the kitchen. I opened a checking account in my name only, and in the little box where the bank asks you to nickname the account, I typed the family fund. Every month, on the 1st, $2,400 would move out of it and into my parents' account, time to land before the home equity payment. Before the light bill, before the insurance draft ever came looking. The property taxes I'd pay straight to the county myself, twice a year, so that no red envelope would ever sit in that drawer again. I was 28 years old. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. And here is the part I didn't tell him. The part I could barely tell myself, standing in that garage with the smell of motor oil and cut grass coming through the open door. Some quiet corner of me was relieved. Not relieved that he was drowning, never that. But relieved to be handed a job. Relieved to be the one who mattered, the one the whole thing quietly ran on. Because as long as the money went out on the first of every month, I would never have to find out something I was far more afraid of than any red envelope. I would never have to find out whether they'd keep me around for free. I didn't have words for that yet, standing there at 28. It would take me 6 years. And a very long night at my own kitchen table before I'd finally sit down and open the one set of books I'd never once audited my own. That night was a long way off. That night I just felt useful. And useful felt so much like being loved that I couldn't tell the two apart, and I didn't try. My father shook my hand. Not a hug, a handshake, firm and dry, the way he'd close any honest deal at the dealership. Then he went back to wiping the bench. And the first of the month came, and I paid. Now here is the part that still amazes me, and I say this as a professional who has watched people do remarkable things with money. The cover story wasn't mine, and it wasn't my father's, it was my mother's. Within a month of that handshake in the garage, before I'd sent the second payment, Loretta announced a family fund to the whole clan. A cheerful little kitty, she called it, for emergencies and holidays. Everybody pitch in what you can. She said it at Sunday dinner like she'd thought of it herself, because as far as she knew, she had. My Aunt Faye put in $25 at Christmas and felt wonderful about it for a week. Cole threw in $50 when his tax refund landed and mentioned it twice. There was a mason jar on my mother's counter with a ribbon around it, and people dropped their guilt in there and went home lighter. She never asked me a single question about any of it, not one. In 6 years, my mother contributed casseroles and a slogan, and somehow she was the manager of the entire story. Whenever anyone in town wondered aloud how Frank and Loretta were getting on since the dealership closed, my mother would smile that particular smile and say, "Oh, Wade's retirement did well." And that was that. The subject closed like a church door. I did the math on it much too late. And when I finally did, it came out to something I've never been able to shake. The person who puts in the least is sometimes the one who decides what the money means. 72 firsts of the month. That's what 6 years comes to, if you're the kind of person who counts, and I am. $2,400, quiet as a heartbeat, on the first of every month. When their furnace died in the January of 2022, the fund bought a new $6,100, installed by an HVAC outfit 2 towns over. My father wouldn't let Cole so much as quote the job, which I thought was strange at the time and understood far too late. A man hiding a fire doesn't invite his son to smell the smoke. So a stranger put the unit in. And my father told everyone the old warranty had covered it. And nobody looked twice at a warranty on a furnace that had been dead 15 years. When the roof started letting rain into the attic, I covered half $4,800, and Dad told the family he'd been setting money aside for it. The fund refilled my mother's arthritis prescription every month, tucked invisibly inside an auto pay she never saw. It kept the truck insured. It floated the whole quiet machine of their lives, and the whole time, I drove my 12-year-old Civic and rented my little apartment above the office and told myself, every spring, that a house could wait 1 more year, then 1 more after that. I passed a for sale sign on my way to work most mornings and taught myself not to slow down. I want to be clear about something because it matters later. I was not a fool about this. In the second year, I sat my father down and pushed to bring the whole thing into the open. Tell Cole, split the load. Make it a real family plan, 4 adults instead of 1 daughter and a secret. It was the sensible thing. It was the sustainable thing. And he wouldn't move an inch. If you make this public, he told me flat, final, the pen still in his shirt pocket, I'll go to a bank before I embarrass your mother. And I knew exactly what kind of bank would take a 59-year-old man with no pension and a second mortgage. I'd seen their offers cross my desk for other people's fathers. 14%, smiling. Papers designed to be signed in the dark by proud men who'd rather drown quietly than say 1 true sentence in the daylight. So I chose the smaller price. I kept my mouth shut and kept writing the checks. That was the family religion if you boiled it down to 1 commandment. It wasn't thou shalt not lie. It was something older and colder than that, never ever be seen needing. Reputation over rescue, appearance over air. It held that family together the way a coat of paint can hold a rotten porch rail together beautifully, right up until the moment someone leans on it. For 6 years, nobody leaned. And then, one Sunday afternoon over burgers in the backyard, my brother decided to expand. It was the 3rd Sunday in June, a year to the week after that handshake in the garage. Burgers on the grill in the backyard on Cedar Hollow Road. My father in the same faded apron we'd given him a decade before. My mother orbiting the picnic table with a pitcher of sweet tea and a running set of stage directions nobody had asked for. Cole stood up somewhere between the potato salad and the cake. He had an announcement, he said, grinning the way he does when he's already decided a thing is going to work out. He was opening a second shop, a bigger bay, out toward the county line, room for 2 more trucks and a full-time tech. Brandy squeezed his arm. His kids cheered because he cheered. And I was happy for him, I truly was, right up until the next voice spoke. Because then my mother set down her pitcher, folded her hands, and beamed at the whole table like a woman unveiling a prize. And your father and I, she said, are lending him $25,000 to get it off the ground, from our savings. I sat very still with a paper plate balanced on my knee, and I felt the ground do something strange and slow beneath the lawn chairs. I knew down to the dollar what my parents had in savings. I knew because I was their savings. There was no $25,000 sitting in an account somewhere, waiting to launch my brother's dream. Or rather it existed, but it existed in a place none of them could see. It existed in the future. In another 2 years of my payments, not made yet. In my Civic staying, alive another winter. In the little brick house on the for sale sign, I would keep on not buying. Driving past it slower each month, like a woman waving at a life through glass. Nobody at that table had asked me a single thing. They had simply promised my labor to my brother, in front of God and the cousins, and signed my father's name to it and called it their own. I waited. I want you to know that I didn't append the picnic table. I let the candles get lit, and the song get sung, and the cake get cut and handed around on those flimsy paper plates. And only then, quietly, in the most level voice I own, I said, before anything gets promised, could the 4 of us maybe talk about the loan? Just Mom, Dad, Cole, and me, before it's set in stone. That was all. You would have thought I'd flipped the table into the roses. Brandy found something fascinating to study on her fork. Cole's ears went red at the tips, the way they've gone red since he was 9 and got caught in a lie. And my mother's smile stayed precisely where it was, while everything behind it moved. Like a house where all the lights go dark but the one on the porch. Not at the table, Nora. Her voice came out smooth and cool, the exact temperature of the tea. This is a celebration. I looked to my father. My father looked at the grill. The grill, for its part, had nothing to contribute. That was the night the silence started, though I didn't know yet how long it would run or how it would end. The family thread, the one we used for birthday cakes and snow warnings, and prayer requests froze over the way a pond freezes, from the edges inward. Slow enough that you don't notice the middle's gone solid until you've already stepped out onto it. Brandy still posted a photo of the kids at the pool. Nobody answered anything I wrote. On the Wednesday, Cole texted me directly. No greeting, no lead-up. Just, why do you always have to run the numbers on people? I stared at that one for a long while, standing at my kitchen counter with the phone in my hand and dinner going cold on the stove. Running the numbers was the single thing I had ever done for this family. It was the reason the lights had stayed on, and the roof had stayed dry, and my mother's hands had stayed loose enough to hold a coffee cup. And somehow it was also, apparently, my crime. I didn't apologize. I hadn't done anything that needed one, and I'd learned, the hard and expensive way. That when you apologize for the truth, all you teach people is that the truth is up for negotiation. So I didn't answer him that night. Instead, I did the thing I do best. I started building a plan. The plan took me 2 days to build. 2 pages, plain language. No blame anywhere in it where things actually stood. What was sustainable and what wasn't. 3 honest ways forward we could choose from together, like grown people. I figured I'd ask my parents for 1 hour some Sunday, lay it flat on the table, and finally let 6 years of held breath out into a room where it could be spoken. I never got to schedule that hour. What I got instead arrived on the 9th day, a Tuesday, at 7:42 in the evening. I'd closed the office, cooked dinner for one, and was rinsing the skillet when the phone lit up on the counter. The family thread. We've talked as a family, and we think it's best you step away for now. We love you, but there's been a lot of strain since Father's Day, and everyone needs room to heal. We hope you'll respect that. Sent from my father's phone. Written, unmistakably, in my mother's hand, I'd know that particular sweetness anywhere, the way you know a cook by the seasoning. 12 people watching. And then, beneath it, that little cartoon thumb from my aunt, floating up like a bubble in still water. I've already told you what I wrote back. What I haven't told you is the arithmetic underneath it, because it wasn't spite. It was a ledger balancing itself. If the family had voted to remove me, then the family could not keep the one part of me that had been paying its bills. A thing has to work in both directions, or it was never true to begin with. You cannot exile the accountant and go on cashing her checks. That equation has to close on both sides, or it was never a family fund at all, just a woman with a checkbook they'd agreed to stop calling kin. So at 11 o'clock I opened the laptop. The transfer for the month was scheduled to run automatically at midnight, the 73rd time it would have left that account, without a soul thanking it. I canceled it. Then I canceled the electronic check set to pay the county's next tax installment. Then the small, faithful autopay that quietly refilled my mother's pharmacy card. 3 clicks. Each one was a year of my life leaving my hands. And the strangest thing, the thing I keep coming back to, is how steady those hands stayed the whole time. Then I turned the ringer off and went to sleep. Here is what most people don't know about the machinery underneath a household, because they've never had to learn it. Banks don't do everything at once. They run their drafts on a calendar, each obligation on its own quiet day. A mortgage reaches in first, in the small dark hours of the month's first morning, before the world is even awake to watch it fail. The electric company waits for its own date. The insurance draft keeps a schedule all its own. So it didn't come down like a wall. It came apart like a slow leak, finding the lowest point one drip at a time. At 2:14 that first morning, the home equity draft reached into my parents' account and found lint. And because I was the daughter who thinks of things, because I was the one who'd set up my father's account alerts years ago, so he'd never miss a warning, his phone lit the dark bedroom on Cedar Hollow Road. Insufficient funds. Payment could not be processed. One alert, one that first night. But one was enough to end their sleep. The electric would bounce 3 days later. The insurance a few days after that. Each failure a fresh chime on a phone belonging to a man who'd gone to bed believing the ground beneath him was simply the ground. And not his daughter, lying still in a rented apartment across town, holding her breath so no one could feel her stop. At 2:15, my own phone began to buzz against the dresser. I looked, one eye screen glare. Dad, I let it go dark. It rang again before the light had faded. And I lay there and felt something I've spent a long time trying to name for you, because it wasn't victory. Victory has a spine to it, a straightness. This was the loose, floating feeling you get when you finally set down a weight you've carried so long your arms have forgotten their own emptiness. Light, and underneath the light a little sick. By sunrise, there was a voicemail. And in 90 seconds of pure fear, my father asked the one question that told me everything about the 6 years behind us. He didn't ask, what did we do? He asked, what happened? I played that voicemail 3 times, sitting on the edge of my bed in the gray light. Not to savor it, I need you to believe that. I played it to be sure of something, and by the 3rd listen I was. Nora, call me back, what happened? The bank flagged everything, the house payment, the lights, all of it. There's alerts going off all over my phone. Your mother's beside herself. Just call, please. The bank flagged everything, like weather. Like a hailstorm nobody could have seen coming. as though the money that had risen up beneath them every month for 6 years were a natural feature of the landscape, a spring in the yard that had, for reasons known only to God, mysteriously gone dry. I typed back one line, "I'm honoring your decision." Then I set the phone face down, showered, and opened the office at 8 sharp, because women like me open at 8 sharp. My assistant, Presley, took one look at my face and made the coffee strong without being asked. The knock came the very next morning, and it wasn't her. Of course it wasn't her. It was 7:40, and my father was standing at the street door of my building with his cap in both hands, turning the brim in slow circles like a rosary. 63 years old, pressed shirt, clean-shaven. A man who had dressed up to come ask his daughter something he would sooner have died than say out loud. "Your mother doesn't know I'm here," he told me, which, in our family, is very nearly a declaration of love. I made him coffee at the little table upstairs, and I watched him take in the apartment like he was seeing it for the first time. The second-hand couch with the throw draped over the torn arm, the particle board bookshelf, the window unit humming its one flat note. His daughter, the one with $180,000, gone out the door, was living like a woman still working toward her first paycheck. And I saw a kind of arithmetic move behind his eyes that had never once crossed them before. He couldn't ask. He got as far as we twice, and the payment once, and each time the sentence died of shame somewhere on the table between us. So I helped him, because 34 years of loving somebody does not switch off in a single Tuesday night. I slid one sheet of paper across the table, every obligation that had ridden quietly on my back for 6 years. Each with its amount and its due date printed plain, not a ledger this time, a handoff. "These are yours now, Dad. And you've got more time than the alerts make it feel like. Late is survivable." I met his eyes. "It's the pretending that costs you." He read it top to bottom, twice. Then he folded it into quarters and tucked it in his shirt pocket, behind the pen, in the exact spot he'd kept everything that mattered since 1985. At the door, with his back already to me, he stopped. "She's telling folks you went through some kind of episode," he said. And then he went down the stairs, one careful step at a time, and left me to find out where my mother had taken the story while he was here confessing it to me. She'd taken it to church. It reached me on Thursday, the way news reaches you in a town like Riverton sideways, and too late to catch. By Sunday, I had quietly become a prayer request. Not from the pulpit, not by name. My mother is an artist, not a vandal. It traveled the women's ministry phone tree the way she travels everything, in soft tones of loving concern. "Nora's going through something. She's cut the whole family off, just cut them clean off. Pray for Loretta. She's holding up so well, bless her heart." And just like that, the pity began flowing in the direction she'd built it to flow, toward my mother. Carried, as all things are carried in that county, on foil-covered dishes. Somebody's husband offered to look at my father's gutters, since apparently the poor man's ungrateful daughter had gone and abandoned her parents in their golden years. My Aunt Faye left me a voicemail that belongs in a museum. 2 full minutes of scripture-adjacent disappointment, every sentence dressed as a hug, closing with the line, "I'll carry to my grave." "I just never thought you'd let money change you, sweetheart. Let money change me." I sat in my parked car outside the office and laughed, until it stopped being laughter and turned into something with no name and no bottom. Then I dried my face, and I went back up to work. The pharmacy called the office on Thursday. That's how these things reach you in a town, like Riverton, not with a summons. Just Janelle from the drive-through window, apologetic, keeping her voice low. My mother's arthritis refill had been declined. The card on file wasn't going through. And Loretta had stood at that counter insisting there'd been some mistake, some computer error. Until the line behind her grew long enough to develop opinions. My mother has hands that ache by June. I know this the way you only know it if you've watched somebody twist a jar lid a little slower every year. If you've seen her set down a coffee cup and flex her fingers when she thinks no one's looking. For 6 years, I'd bought those pills quietly, folded into the same auto pay as everything else, so that she never once had to feel the ache and the cost in the same afternoon. Here is where I want to be exact, because it matters to me that you understand what I was doing, and just as much what I wasn't. The fund was closed. The fund stayed closed, but I drove over on my lunch break, paid for the refill at the counter in person, and set that one prescription that single, specific bottle to bill straight to me from then on, no card of hers involved, no fund resurrected. Just her medicine and me, and no lesson in between. Presley asked me, when I got back, why on earth I'd pay for anything after what they'd done. I gave her the only answer I had. The fund was a lie I'm finished telling, I said. But her joints aren't a lesson. Boundaries, it turns out, need a steady hand, and mine were only days old and still wobbling. But that particular line felt straight when I drew it. So I drew it, and I let the rest stay crooked. On Monday at 5, Cole's truck pulled up outside my office, and he did not come up the stairs happy. My brother filled the doorway the way he's filled doorways since high school, arms crossed, jaw leading. Mom says you froze the family's money, he said. The fund, everybody's fund. Because your feelings got bruised at cookout. Presley discovered something that urgently needed filing in the back room. Everybody's fund, I repeated, and I let it sit in the air a second. Cole. One question, and then I'll answer anything you want to throw at me. In 6 years, how much have you put into it? His mouth opened on a figure he did not have. I watched him go looking for it, the Christmas 50. The year of the tax refund, maybe. I watched my brother do more math in 10 seconds than he'd done in 6 years. And I watched the total come back to him small and cold, and a great deal lighter than the word everybody's had felt in his mouth a moment before. That's not the point, he said, but quieter now. Because Cole builds things for a living, and he'd just heard a joist creak somewhere deep in the story he'd been handed. It's exactly the point. I didn't freeze everybody's money, Cole. I stopped giving mine. Those are 2 different sentences. He stood there turning it over. And then my brother said the thing that told me the ground under Cedar Hollow Road had never been as solid as either of us had been raised to believe. Dad's been strange about money since the dealership, cash for everything. Wouldn't let me quote him for that furnace back in 22, and then all of a sudden the warranty covered it. He looked at me, and I watched the question arrive in his face before he could stop it. Warranties don't cover acts of daughter, Cole. I said it gently. As gently as I've ever said anything. Go ask your parents, not me. It was never mine to tell, and it still isn't. He left without slamming the door, which for my brother is a white flag. That Sunday, I drove out to Cedar Hollow at 10:30, when I knew the pews would be holding them. On my key ring, between the office key and the one for the Civic, hung a third brass, worn soft at the edges, cut for me the summer I turned 16. 18 years I'd carried that key, through every apartment and every winter coat pocket. If I was to step away, then the door I'd always been able to walk through was no longer a door that was mine. And I wasn't going to hold a lie in metal. I sealed it in a plain envelope, no note, and taped it to the inside of the storm door where the screen would keep the rain off it. Then I stood on that porch a minute, in the quiet. The grass was 2 weeks long my father mowed on Saturdays, always had and hadn't. The chains on the swing were blooming rust. And through the kitchen window, I could see the wall calendar that had hung beside the phone since before anyone in that house owned a cell phone. What I saw on it followed me home and has never entirely left. Every first of the month, June, July, August, all of them was circled. Red pen, my mother's hand. My mother, who had never once asked me a single question about the fund. Who managed the whole story and touched none of the math. She had been circling the day my money landed, month after month, for 6 years the way you'd circle a birthday. She had known the rhythm of me by heart. She just never said my name out loud over it. Here is how the truth started to leak. And I promise you I didn't spring the leak. I'd stopped touching that plumbing altogether. With my parents visibly coming apart at the edges, the shaggy lawn, the sagging gutters. The prayer chain running overtime on their behalf, one of the cousins floated the obvious kindness. Why not help Wade and Loretta out of the family fund, the kitty? The rainy day jar we all pitched into. So my Aunt Fay, who, as it turned out, was the name listed on that cheerful little mason jar account my mother had opened years ago, purely for appearances, walked into the branch on Main and asked the teller for a balance and a history. 6 years of the whole clan's generosity, laid out on a single printed slip. $1,300 and change, the birthday 20s, the Christmas 50s. One ambitious 100 from Uncle Roy back in 2023 that he'd found a way to mention at least once a year since. That was the entire safety net the family believed had been holding 2 people up. Faye stood in that lobby and looked at the number, and the number looked back, and neither of them blinked. Then what's been paying? She started to ask me that on the phone later. And she stopped halfway through the sentence, because 60 years in this family had already taught her exactly what fills a gap that size. And says nothing about it, me. The little cartoon thumb she'd tapped so breezily 9 days earlier was sitting in her lap now, and it had gotten heavy. But my mother, God love her, was already 3 steps ahead of both of us. Because that same week, the story changed shape again. The new version reached me through Brandy, who'd picked it up at a church picnic and called me, honestly bewildered by it. In this telling, I had not been paying for anything. I had been controlling, for years apparently. I'd had my hands clamped around my parents' accounts. Poor Wade couldn't buy a cup of coffee without my say-so, and the family had at last, lovingly and very bravely, asked me to loosen my grip. My exile, rewritten as an intervention. And that version was pointed straight at the one thing of mine my mother could still reach. You have to understand what I do for a living. I hold the books for 24 small businesses in a town where reputation is the only currency that never inflates. A bookkeeper rumored to have quietly seized control of her own parents' money is not a bookkeeper for very long. It took 11 days. Mr. Prout, who owns the tire and auto shop, who'd been my client since the week I hung my shingle, came in, not quite able to meet my eyes, and asked for his files back. No offense meant, Nora. It's just there's talk, and my wife's in the Bible study, you understand. I understood. I had his records boxed, indexed, and handed off to the new accountant within 24 hours. With a transition checklist, so clean it was very nearly rude. Because the only reply I've ever found to just talk is work that leaves nothing to talk about. Then I sat in my office after closing, with the lights off, and let myself feel the whole shape of it for about 10 minutes. I had stopped paying. That was allowed, that had always been allowed. But she was now spending my name to make up the difference. The one account of mine she could still overdraw. That night my phone buzzed once, a voicemail from my father. And his voice had a gravel in it that hadn't been there at my kitchen table. That hadn't been there in the garage 6 years before. That I'm not sure had ever been there in my whole life. The truck's gone, Nora. Sold it Tuesday to a fella over in Athens. Caught up the electric and the insurance with what he gave me. A pause, long enough that I thought the message had ended. Don't tell your mother I told you. She's telling folks we're just storing it for the winter. 20 years. 20 years my father had kept that F-150 alive, new plugs, fresh oil, a hand-washed hood every Sunday it didn't rain. It was the one thing in the world he loved that couldn't talk back or be disappointed in him. And he'd handed the keys to a stranger in a parking lot to cover a light bill, and then walked home. And built a small lie to keep my mother from having to know he'd done it. I sat with the phone against my ear long after the recording went quiet. Then one more message came through. The longest my father had ever typed to me in his life. I could feel every slow letter of it. Meet me at the diner out on Old Route 30 tomorrow. I'll buy the coffee. There's something you need to see before your mother signs anything. I read that last line twice. Before your mother signs anything. I did not sleep much that night. The diner out on Old Route 30 has vinyl booths the color of root beer, and a waitress named Sue who calls every soul who walks in Han. My father was in the back booth with his cap off and his hands folded on the table, and he didn't start with the manila folder sitting beside him. He started with 1978. You know your mother grew up on a farm, he said. I knew the postcard version. The land out past the county line, sold before I was born, spoken of once or twice and never with any detail. I'd always assumed it was sold the ordinary way, the way farms change hands. It wasn't sold, he said. It was lost. Auctioned off the courthouse, steps the spring your mother turned 13. Bad paper and a worse harvest behind it. Her daddy stood in that crowd and watched a man paint lot numbers on his own hay rake. The church had rallied, he told me, the way churches do. Groceries left on the porch in the dark. A collection envelope with the family's name read aloud from the front, so everyone would know whose need it answered. And coats donated, coats for the children, good warm ones, handed down from families who had more than enough. And in the collar of the one my mother was given, written in careful marker by some other mother's hand, was another girl's name. She wore that coat 2 winters, my father said, turning his coffee cup a slow quarter turn and not drinking from it. Whole school knowing whose it used to be. I sat there with my own coffee going cold in front of me. 40 years I had known this woman had been raised and fed and corrected and prayed over by her, and no one had ever handed me the key that opened her. At her wedding, he went on, her daddy pulled her aside. Man who never said 3 words in a row in his life. And he told her, don't you ever let this family be the ones being prayed for again. It didn't excuse a single casserole of what she was doing to me. I want to be plain about that. Knowing why a thing is broken doesn't unbreak it, but it explained the engine. My mother wasn't lying to wound me. She had been lying for so long, and so early, that the lie had become load-bearing. Pull it out, and the whole roof of her comes down on top of her. And then my father said the part that turned my stomach in a way the auction never could. That other girl, the one whose name my mother had worn stitched at her throat for 2 winters, her family was still at First Baptist. Still to this very day, in the women's ministry. In the very circle, my mother had spent 40 years learning to run. She hadn't fled the thing that shamed her. She had gone back and taken command of it. She stood at the head of the exact congregation that had once left coats on her family's porch. And she decided now who got prayed for and who did the praying. The frightened 13-year-old hadn't disappeared. She'd simply spent 4 decades building a fortress on the spot where the shame had happened, and she ruled it. I'm telling you all this, my father said, so you know what I'm standing against when I tell you she'd rather go under than wave for help. Then he slid the folder across the table, and the past stopped mattering quite so much because the folder was about the future. A flyer, first. Cheerful yellow, senior homeowner relief in letters like a county fair banner. And beneath it, an application, filled in down to the second-to-last line in my mother's neat church bulletin handwriting. Everything complete but the signatures. I read it the way a surgeon reads an X-ray of someone she loves. 13.9% interest. An origination fee dressed up as a processing courtesy. Payments that looked almost gentle for the first 2 years, and then climbed like a fever chart. And the whole thing staked against the house, the paid-off house, the single asset my parents actually owned free and clear in this world. It was the kind of loan that exists for one reason only. Because proud people will sign their name in the dark with strangers before they'll say one true sentence to their own family in the light. She hears things catching up to us, my father said. This way nobody knows, not the church, not the cousins, a beat, not even you. I put my palm flat on the paper as if I could hold it down to the table by weight alone. Dad, this isn't a rope. It's an anchor somebody painted to look like one. I know what it is. His voice cracked clean through the middle, the first time in my whole life I'd heard that happen. But I can't give her the other thing. The other thing is everybody knowing. There it was. The whole family religion, boiled down to one sentence at last. I looked out the window at the gravel lot for a long moment, and I did the only honest arithmetic left to me. I could write a check tonight, quietly, and be the ground under them again, and we would all sink back into the same warm lie and drown in it politely, on a payment schedule. Or I could stay out, clean and principled, and watch my mother mortgage the last thing she owned inside a month. I'm not writing checks in the dark, not ever again, I said. That part's finished. He nodded slowly, like a man agreeing at a graveside. But there's a third way, Dad. It just costs. I need everyone in one kitchen, and first I need a week. If you don't know what a HUD housing counselor is, write it down somewhere and keep it. Someday somebody you love is going to need one, and the meeting is free. Ms. Reyes worked out of a shared office near the courthouse, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a green plant that had clearly survived worse years than this one. She treated my parents' finances, which I laid out for her from memory, every figure, every date the way a good plumber treats a flooded basement. Unglamorous, fixable, no sermon included in the estimate. In 1 hour with her, I learned more useful things than that cheerful yellow flyer had ever wanted anyone to know. The county would put the overdue tax installment on a payment plan, and the penalties would stop growing the very day we set it up. The bank holding the home equity line would far sooner restructure the debt than chase a 63-year-old man into default. Because paperwork is cheaper than lawyers, and they knew it. There was an owner-occupancy credit on the property taxes my father had simply never filed for small, but real, and his for the asking. 6 years running, and then Ms. Reyes took her glasses off and said the grown-up thing. The one I'd been circling for weeks without ever quite landing on it. The simplest fix is almost always the hardest one for families, Ms. Hale. She let that settle. That is a great deal of house for 2 people on a fixed income, and a house is not a family. It's a bill with a lot of memories attached to it. I drove home the long way that evening. Past the little brick place on Marigold Street with the for sale sign leaning tiredly in the yard, and I did not slow down. And I did not write down the number, not yet, that night at my own kitchen table. With a mug of coffee gone cold between my hands, I finally opened the one set of books I had never once audited in 6 years, mine. I sat there and made myself ask the question a bookkeeper asks about any account that won't reconcile. What did this money actually buy? Not their solvency, that part was real, and I don't regret $1 of it. Not the roof, not the furnace, not the pills that kept my mother's hands loose. Those purchases were honest, and I'd make them again. No, the other purchase. The quiet one, folded invisibly inside every single transfer, the one I'd never let myself itemize. As long as the money went out on the first of the month, I never had to find out whether they would keep me around for free. There it was. Plain as a debit in the wrong column. Every transfer had been a receipt, and every receipt had said the same word, needed. And needed was a word I knew how to earn. I could work for needed. I could stay up until 1 in the morning during tax season and buy needed by the hour. It was loved I never trusted loved, was a coin I'd been too frightened to flip. So for 6 years, I'd kept the coin in my pocket and paid for needed instead, on time, every month. And called the arrangement a family. My mother had kept a lie, running for 40 years, to stay off the charity list at her church. And I had kept a fund running for 6 to stay off a list of my own. Same steeple, different pew. I'll tell you, the realization didn't arrive like lightning. It arrived like finding a single misplaced entry that you've been carrying across every statement for years. The sick drop first, when you see it. And then, right behind it, something almost like relief. Because a found error is a fixed error. You can only correct the books once you're finally willing to read them. I turned an envelope over I've always thought more clearly in ink, and I wrote one line on the back of it. There is a difference between being under a family and being in one. I'd been under mine so long, and so willingly, that I had taught myself to call the weight of it belonging. So I built the whole thing that night, on a single clean sheet of paper. Not a lifeline dropped into the dark, a plan with the lights on. What I would pay, one time, to zero out the damage that was overdue. What I could contribute after that, a real number, with an end date printed beside it, not an open vein. What Cole could reasonably carry. What Faye could do that wasn't money at all. And what my mother and father would have to do in return for any of it to be real. One meeting, one signature, one spring. Every line of it survivable, and every last line of it out loud, it could work. I was almost sure it could work. There was exactly one person on this earth guaranteed to fight it like it was death itself. I sent the plan to the family thread. The same thread, I want that understood. The one with the birthday cakes and the snow warnings. The one that had voted me off the island at 7:42 on a Tuesday, with a cartoon thumb for a gavel. 9 days of my silence sat stacked above it like old snow that never melted. Sunday, 4 o'clock, Mom and Dad's kitchen, about the family fund. I'll answer every question anyone in this family has ever had. Everyone should come. Then I set the phone down and made myself dinner, and I'll be honest with you, my hands were not nearly as level as that message had been. The replies came in, and they came in strict order of character. Cole first, I'll be there. Brandy, a single heart. Uncle Rye, what fund? Lol. God keep Uncle Rye, the one genuinely honest man in 3 counties, who to this day has no idea he was funny. My mother answered privately. 1 line, no greeting, no punctuation wasted. There is nothing to discuss. I didn't reply to her, because as far as I was concerned, there wasn't. And then, on the main thread, beneath my invitation, where all 12 of them could see it and remember everything, my Aunt Faye reacted with a thumbs up. The same little hand. Aimed, this time, in an entirely different direction. I looked at it and felt something turn over in my chest that was 1 part laughter and 1 part of forgiveness that had shown up early, before I'd decided to grant it. Saturday night, around 9, someone knocked on my apartment door, and I remember thinking Cole had forgotten how a doorbell works. It wasn't Cole. My mother stood on my landing in her good blue cardigan, hair set, spine straight as a fence post, her purse held in front of her with both hands like a shield she'd carried up the stairs, and it struck me, looking at her through the screen, that in the 4 years I had lived above that office, Loretta Hale had never once set foot inside her daughter's home. "May I come in?" she said. It was shaped like a question and built like an instruction. I opened the door anyway. She perched on the edge of my second hand, couched the way you sit in a waiting room. And her eyes made 1 slow circuit of the place, the particle board shelf, the humming window unit, the civic keys in the dish by the door, and I watched her file the whole inventory away, somewhere she would never have to look at it again. She declined tea, and then my mother, who had not spoken a word to me in 6 weeks, made me the finest offer she has ever made another living soul. "Come home, Nora, soft, almost warm, Sunday dinners. Your chair, right where it's always been. We'll tell people it was a mix-up with the bank. These things happen. Nobody your father's age understands computers. The fund goes back to just the way it was, a small breath. And there's no need for any meeting. There it sat. Everything I had ever wanted, wrapped in a bow, resting on top of the exact thing that had been quietly killing me for 6 years. And because my mother is not, and has never been, a stupid woman, she did not stop there. She leaned in. And her voice dropped to the register she used to use when I was small, and running a fever, the one that could once make a whole bad day go quiet. And she picked up the knife she knows the best. "Sweetheart," she said. "You were always happiest when you were helping. That's who you are, it's who you've always been." She tilted her head. "Why do you need them all to see it?" I would love to tell you I felt nothing. I felt everything. Because that one sentence had been steering my life since a summer evening in a garage in 2020, and she had just spoken it out loud, across my own couch, and handed it to me like a compliment. She was almost to the door when I said it, quietly to her back. "Best for who, Mom?" My mother stopped for exactly 1 heartbeat. Then she let herself out, and her footsteps going down my stairs were perfectly even, all the way to the bottom. And God help me, some tired, ancient part of me sat there on that couch and wanted, with everything it had left, to take the deal. Sunday came, and the kitchen on Cedar Hollow Road was fuller than it had been since my grandmother's funeral. My mother had staged the room the way she stages everything. There was a chair set out in the middle of the floor, turned to face all the others, the apology chair, though no one called it that. There was a coffee cake on the counter that nobody would touch. My father sat at the head of the table with his hands folded like a man in a pew. Cole and Brandy took the folding chairs along the wall. Faye appointed herself to the percolator, and that old pot muttered and spat behind her like it knew things it wasn't saying. On the wall by the phone, the calendar still hung open to August. The first of the month was circled in red, a red ring that had waited all month for money that never came. I stood a second at the storm door before I knocked. The tape mark was still there on the glass, a faint ghost rectangle where I'd left the key. Whoever I'd been the last time I touched that door, I wasn't her anymore. "Come in, Nora," my mother said to the window over the sink without turning. "Say what you came to say." Faye pulled the empty chair out for me, helpful as ever. I looked at it dead center, facing the jury built for a penitent. "Thank you, Faye," I said. "I'll stand." And I did not open with an apology. "I didn't bring paper," I told the room. "You don't forget numbers you've lived." Then, in the same even voice I'd used to walk a client through a hard year, I laid the 6 years out on the table where everyone could see them. June of 2020. The red envelope in the junk drawer, $4,910, past due on this very house. The pension buyout that came back cents on the dollar. The account I'd opened that summer. And the $2,400 that left it on the first of every month, for 72 months. Time to land under the mortgage, and the lights and the insurance before any of them could hit the ground. The furnace in the winter of 22 that was never a warranty coal, half the roof. My mother's prescriptions, quietly full every single month. All told, I said, a little over $180,000. And I said that number slowly. Not for drama, because a figure that size deserves the same respect you'd give a name. Nobody moved. Brandy had both hands pressed over her mouth. Faye sat down without checking that the chair was behind her. Then I turned to my father, because this was the whole reason I had come. Dad didn't fail anybody. I made myself say it carefully so it would land as fact and not comfort. The dealership closed, that's arithmetic, it isn't sin. And it was never a secret worth what it's cost this family to keep it. My father looked down at the table, and his shoulders came down an inch the way a man's do when he finally sets a heavy box on the floor. My mother turned from the counter at last. The dish towel still folded perfectly over her wrist. And she smiled at the room the way she smiles at a stain on good linen. "Are you finished?" she said. "Because I would like to say a word about your sister's condition." She addressed it to the room, over the top of my head. "You've all watched it happen." She shut herself up above that little office. She had control of your father's accounts for years. Poor Wade couldn't buy himself a cup of coffee. And when we lovingly asked her to step back, you can all see for yourselves what she's done to this family in 6 weeks. This is what money does to a person who, stop Loretta. My father's voice was not loud. In 63 years, I don't believe it had ever once been loud, which is exactly why the whole kitchen turned toward him as if the refrigerator had. Spoken, he was on his feet. His hand was flat on the table, palm down, on the very spot he'd sworn on in the garage 6 years before. "Every word she said is true," he told them. "Every number, every date. Hiding it was my doing, and it was wrong, and I am done." One sentence of confirmation. That was all he offered, and all that was needed. And I want to be exact about it because it matters. He was not rescuing me. The truth was already standing in that room on its own 2 feet. He was simply refusing, for the first time in his life, to sit back down next to the lie. And my mother, my composed, him-voiced mother, who had run 4 straight decades on the fuel of being fine, came apart at the one seam none of us had ever known was there. I will not be a charity case in my own church twice. It tore out of her ragged, nothing artful left in it. Do you know what they do with families like that? They pray for you out loud, by name from the front. I wore a coat with another girl's name written in the collar for 2 winters. And every soul in that school smiled at me, and I would rather be dead than be that child again. Do you hear me? I would rather, she caught herself. One torn breath, in a kitchen gone so quiet the wall clock sounded like a hammer. Every face at that table had just met the 13-year-old, and every face turned to me. I could have finished her. Understand that. She was down, the room was mine, and 34 years of swallowed words were lined up behind my teeth with their engines running. That is the exact moment revenge stories are built to live for. And standing in it, I found that I didn't want it. Beating my mother in her own kitchen would only have been one more way of staying in her game, at her table, playing for her stakes. So I took a single folded sheet of paper out of my blazer, not evidence. An offer, and I laid it flat in the middle of the table. Next to the cake no one had touched. Here's what I can do, I said, and the terms it comes with. Tomorrow morning, I pay the county and the bank, and zero out everything that's overdue. That's about $3,700 all in. After that, $1,200 a month for 18 months, not a trap door. A number with an end date written down. And it goes on a sheet taped to this refrigerator where every person in this room can read it any day they like. Cole puts in what Cole can. Faye drives Mom to her appointments and picks up the prescriptions. I looked at each of them as I said it, and in exchange, two things. Mom and Dad sit down one time with a housing counselor named Ms. Reyes. And come spring, this house goes on the market because it's a bill with a lot of memories, and it is eating the two of you alive. Then I looked at my mother, and I made it as gentle as an ultimatum can be made. Everything in the daylight, Mom, or nothing at all, those are mine. She stared at me across her own kitchen for a long moment. And then she set the dish towel on the counter, squared it edge to edge the way she has her entire life, and walked out of her own kitchen, through her own storm door, into her own backyard. The screen clapped shut behind her, nobody breathed. And my father reached into his shirt pocket, behind the folded list I'd handed him weeks before, and took out his pen. He didn't sign it right away. He read it out loud first, my father, who had hidden every figure for 6 years, sitting at the head of his table and reading each line to his family in a steady voice, the overdue amount, the monthly number, the end date. The meeting, the spring, making himself say it, making them hear it. It was the bravest bookkeeping I have ever witnessed in my life. Then he signed and slid the sheet to Cole. And my brother, who had walked into that kitchen, still owed a dream, wrote $200 a month in the margin, initialed it, and said, "Forget the 25. In the flat voice of a man paying off a debt he'd only just discovered he owed. Faye signed up for Tuesdays and the pharmacy, and cried quietly onto the untouched cake. Here is the part I could not have arranged if I'd tried, and would never have tried to. I never told the town a thing. Not one receipt, not one correction, not one word posted anywhere. But a number that size does not stay in a kitchen. It went the way everything goes in Riverton, sideways, over back fences, in low voices at the feed store. And a week after that Sunday, Mrs. Tilly, who had carried her good scalloped potatoes up those steps back, when they were pitty, climbed them again with another dish, set it down on the counter, and said just one thing to my mother on her way out. "Wade's lucky to have a daughter like that." Then she left. She didn't accuse anyone of anything. Nobody did. The whole town simply knew now, and for a woman who had spent 40 years running on being seen a certain way, being seen clearly was the only sentence that could ever really land. The potatoes kept coming after that. But they were friendship potatoes now, not pity potatoes. And if you think a town can't taste the difference, you've never lived in one. I went out to the backyard while the others were still passing the pen around. The evening was going gold at the edges. My mother stood in her Sunday dress, deadheading the roses with her bare fingers, her back straight and turned to the house. The screen announced me, and she didn't turn. "You've made me small," she said to the roses, loud enough for the kitchen to hear. "No, Mom, the lie was small. And you've been carrying it a great deal longer than I carried the money. I only had 6 years. You've had it since you were 13. Her shears stilled on a stem. She didn't turn around. I'd known she wouldn't. You don't undo a woman like Loretta Hale in a backyard on a Sunday evening. But after a while, in a voice I had never once heard her use flat and bare, like a person setting a heavy purse down at the end of a very long day, my mother asked the only question she had left. "What happens on the 1st of the month now?" "Breakfast," I said, "if you want it." The roses moved a little in the breeze. "Your father likes the diner out on Old Route 30, she said, to the garden. From my mother, that was not surrender. but it was an address. The house on Cedar Hollow Road sold the following May to a young family with a swing set folded flat in a rented trailer before the ink was even dry. $212,000. The home equity line was paid off right there at the closing table. And what was left after everything came to $150,000 of pure breathing room. And a 2-bedroom patio, home 4 blocks from First Baptist, where the yard is the size of a dining table, and my father has declared personal war on its single hedge. My mother told the church they had downsized to simplify. The whole congregation nods along when she says it. The whole congregation knows. Both of those things are true at once now, and somehow the town has made room for them to be. The sheet is on the new refrigerator. 4 signatures. Faye added herself a column. Everything in the daylight, where a lie has nowhere left to sit, and in the 9th month. There was a first of the month, where my father covered his own gap. And my line on the sheet read 900 instead of 12, and he circled that date on the new calendar himself. In black pen, not red. The first Saturday of every month, we have breakfast at the diner out on Old Route 30. My father pays for the coffee with cash he counts out of a worn envelope, and I let him because letting him is the entire point. My mother came for the first time in June. She sat on the edge of the booth like it was my couch, ordered tea, corrected no one's posture, and when Sue called her Han, something in her face very nearly allowed it. Presley said something to me the week I signed the papers on the little brick house on Marigold Street, my own name, on a deed at 35. The porch, the tired sign finally taken down. She said, "You're the first person I ever watched walk out of something without waiting for anybody's permission." And when my father came to see the place, he handed me a key to the patio home, newly cut, still bright from the machine. Nobody had asked him to. It lives in my kitchen drawer now, and this time it isn't a duty. It's an invitation. And I finally know the difference because for 6 years, I paid dearly not to. If a family only stands when you're standing underneath it, holding it up in the dark, that was never a home. It was a weight. Real family is the thing you get to stand inside on your emptiest day with both your hands free. That's my story. 1 group message, 1 thumbs up. 89 missed calls, and a key I finally handed back so a better one could find me. If you're the one quietly holding your whole family up in the dark right now, I hope you heard this. The daylight is allowed. Tell me your story down in the comments, because somebody scrolling by tonight needs to read exactly yours. And subscribe, because next week there's another one just like this.